we just generally ask that, like, is it a leftist film? That's not like makes it good or bad. Just like we're just taking the temperature of the film.
Is it an explicitly leftist film? This is explicitly leftist podcast.
It's a question we're going to ask.
There is no left Hollywood. There's liberal Hollywood, and the right likes to conflate these things.
What a glorious time.
You mean peak COVID?
All right, well, when you put it that way.
What a glorious, lots of free time to watch movies and record time, for sure. We're already up to speed. We know what's going on here. We're just waiting for him to get in there and strangle him with his dick again. So let's get to that scene.
Let's do this.
I don't know what his politics were at this point. I mean, I know he sort of gets all Maoist-y when everybody gets Maoist-y, but I mean, who didn't?
Okay. Oh, the 58 coup. Okay,
yeah.
Sorry. That's not CIA.
This is a werewolf episode, God damn it.
Just not the one you were hoping for.
Yeah, and when that happens, when the werewolf comes out, you're like, God damn, all right, this movie's awesome.
Victor Ostrovsky, the screenwriter on that, former Mossad agent.
Oh, wow.
Not sure what needs to be unpacked there, but...
Yeah, I'm sure there's plenty of fuckery here. How many people have you tortured?
Well, that doesn't really change how fucked the system is. We don't have time for baby steps right now.
Because when I watch a Godard movie, I kind of like, this is very smart. I'm very impressed with your form. I want to slap you. You feel so fucking smug.
Well, do you think this is a leftist film?
No, not at all. We're going to have to atone for this movie.
Lead a open rebellion, then the camp gets napalmed, and then revolution, I guess? Fuck capitalism. Fuck all of this stuff.
Welcome all to the politics of cinema. On this show, we believe films are never neutral. There's a political as well as an artistic message captured in every film, in every time period, and in every country, and we are on the lookout for all of it. My name is Aaron Spears.
And my name is Isaac Miller. And on this, our 3-year anniversary of this podcast celebration, the first of 2 episodes that we'll be focusing on this, or we will be celebrating this, we are looking at Robert Kramer's experimental opus, Milestones from 1975.
Well, if it's 2-episode focus, what's our focus for the 2 episodes?
Well, we're going to be looking at the Vietnam anti-war movement.
Indeed. How are we supposed to count this? If we started in 2020 and it's now 2024, we're wrapping up the 3rd year, but we're kicking off the 4th year. I don't know how the anniversary works that way.
Wait, so we actually started at the very end of 2019.
No, first episode was... Well, I'll edit this part. We were recording then. Our first episode came out January 2020.
All right, January 2020.
Yeah.
We're going into our 4th year now.
Going into the 4th year, yeah. But so the anniversary, though, is it's a 3rd anniversary. This is completely boring. We don't need to hash this out, I don't think. But yes, I guess if you're, like your birthday, you celebrate your first birthday at the end of the 1st year.
Yes, it's true. All right,
yeah.
So exactly.
We're 3.
We're 3.
Yeah.
We're going into 4.
Maybe we should do 3 films. I don't know. We don't need to get we'll get distracted for all of 2024 with Vietnam stuff, which we actually probably could do. But I like that you said experimental opus because I think Milestones really is part more of the experimental avant-garde filmmaking style, even though it has sort of a semblance of narrative to another movie that came out in 1975, which is Robert Altman's Nashville, as far as a sprawling multi-character look at a whole swath of the population. Although Nashville's only in, one town, this is kind of across the whole country, geographically speaking. But it made me realize how much of a kind of conventional asterisk narrative that Nashville is compared to this one.
I believe that.
Which is saying something, because Nashville's not that conventional.
No.
But
I think that's just it. I think it very much, a little bit of my twee sensors went off with this movie. Not twee sensors. It's sort of like, why are we doing this way? And I know there is a purpose to this, right? It's an immersive purpose. I mean, it's almost like a home movie for him and his friends.
Yeah. It does feel that way. And as we'll get into just a second, it's a natural extension of how his early filmography lines up. And you do get the impression that it's very personal verite cinema, in which even if they're not your friends, these are not professional actors, but they are doing a great job at doing what they need to do within this movie. So maybe more of like that Italian neorealism like approach to it, like we were talking about with the Dupes almost a few episodes back.
Yeah, I mean, so part of it is so there's this way when you're dealing with non-professional actors. I mean, they all sort of sound like the same person at a level. There's a certain maybe not. Maybe that's not fair, but there's a certain introspective. I don't know. There's sort of introspective quality to the way they all talk to each other about feelings, about so forth.
I was just gonna say, how many characters this start their sentences with like, well, I feel, well, I'm
Yeah,
feeling, well, I feel, which, maybe that's just indicative of the types of people within the movements and within the new left space that he's exploring in this movie. Maybe that's just indicative of personality types that would gravitate towards that,
yeah.
I think, as well. So I guess we start off with a little bio of Kramer.
Let's start with a bio. Let us set the stage talking about this film.
Indeed. I guess we should say officially, credits wise, credit where credit's due. He is not the solo, Robert Kramer's not the solo director here. It's co-directed, co-filmed, and co-edited by John Douglas, who was kind of around Kramer's crew for a little while there. But Kramer's credits on this one, Robert Kramer's credits are wrote, directed, filmed, and edited. So, like we've often mentioned with credits here, it's the hallmark of a passion project, I would have to say.
Right.
He wants to be making this.
It better be a passion
It
project.
better be. Kind of the way we were discussing Buñuel with The Exterminating Angel previously, Kramer seems to be one of those types of artists that like there isn't like, okay, here's my or here's my political life, here's my artistic life, here's my personal life. It's all just his life. And there's just everything overlaps and feeds into each other. Do you get that feeling watching this?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's almost sort of it feels like the point, right? Like
Yeah.
this is, he's like it it's that, in a certain sense, I mean, he's looking at presumably his political crew, right? So
Mhm.
this is a movie set in 1975 from 1975 of a group of basically anti-war activists from various places, though they all sort of know each other, right? Like they're all sort of interconnected at some level.
Yeah, a good portion of them at least, I would say, yeah.
And, this is the moment that they're in is specifically, basically 2 years after US like major combat operations have ended. And so the anti-war movement in a lot of ways is, well, as we'll see, we have an interview with a special guest coming up who's gonna speak on this moment within the anti-war movement. The mass anti-war movement has in many ways evaporated. The anti-war movement itself has not disappeared, but it is continuing specifically in attempts to defund the war.
Mhm.
But so this is like a very specific moment in which you could sort of say I mean, they couldn't have known this, but the cycle of protest that you could even say goes back into the 1950s with the civil rights movement is running its course. And certainly the anti-war movement is sort of the mass anti-war movement that had sort of created that space in the 60s moment is starting to sort of has evaporated in a lot of ways for the people in this movie.
Right, right. Whether or not they were just, like you said, kind of more casually there or actual organizers, et cetera. But
So like, there's a movie called Milestones, and specifically these are people who are hitting their late 20s or maybe early 30s and are having kids or have had kids even a few years before. And so a lot of this is about different stages of life that they're entering into.
literally with one of the final scenes in the movie,
Yeah.
which we'll get to, that's a really good point, honestly. And it's like kind of smack me myself in the forehead dumb feeling right now. While watching this movie and taking notes, I actually wrote something down. I'm like, why did he call this Milestones? Because I was thinking of it more from like the organizer anti-war perspective of the milestones that are passed for them. But
Right.
you're right. This is a new milestone for all these characters. Like, what now?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, good call. I wish we could have thought of something that great at the end of Exterminating Angel when we were like, what the fuck is this movie about? Right. And I think also that wraps up in Robert Kramer being such a personal filmmaker because it was probably something he was wrestling with at that moment as well, especially since we have a filmmaker character in this movie.
Yeah.
Um,
Who's an actual filmmaker in real life.
right. Well, leading up to this movie, then too, there's some really good context for Kramer. One, because I found a quote of his I'll do the full bit of it at the end of the show, but he says eventually all these movies I make will end up being one long film. And I think the early part of his career really speaks to that and how he's building a career. Also, I love when a filmmaker isn't trained in filmmaking, which also there were film programs, but you couldn't really be necessarily a film major the way we think of it now in the early 60s, late 50s, early 60s. So he's a philosophy and history graduate, comes from what they described in one of the biographies I read as a well-to-do New York Jewish family. What a phrase, right?
Yeah, a lot going on there, but
Yeah. So he was a dedicated community activist. One of the bios I was reading of him said he went to work in a poor black ghetto of Newark, New Jersey, and was a Students for Democratic Society member in the mid to late 60s. And then he is, I don't say inadvertently, but he's in a documentary from 66. It's a short documentary called Troublemakers, where they're specifically looking at SDS, well, what's described in the film description as SDS militants, in their attempt to politicize and organize people of Newark, New Jersey. And Kramer is in there because he's one of the activists. He's not a filmmaker. He's one of the SDS folks. Like he's in it because of his political activism before he even becomes or starts being a filmmaker. 1 year later, there's the big Vietnam protest march on the Pentagon building, which Kramer is there for again as an activist. But he ends up meeting up with, I feel like that was the one I was reading about where like Jonas Mekas is there. There's a whole bunch of other folks that are around that are artists or musicians. Some of them are, interested in filmmaking or the power of film. And so they start this collective called the Newsreel, and they make over 60 documentary films. Robert Kramer's quote about newsreel is kind of fun. He said, "We want to form a propaganda that polarizes, angers, excites for the purposes of discussion, a way of getting at people, not by making concessions to where they are, but by showing them where you are and then forcing them to deal with that." Which I thought that's a very awesome, very confrontational idea when you're making your own propaganda, as he puts it.
right, which this is not.
No, it's not. But that set the groundwork for overlapping his activism, his organizing, and his art, in this case, filmmaking, because there's networks going out through dozens of cities that they can get these newsreels out to. So if you're organizing and you're part of an organizing effort in the late 60s, these films are, I guess I don't know how widely they were distributed, but it seems like within a lot of the major cities, these films, these short documentaries they're making were getting out to people. And not a good number of them, a few of them you can find just on YouTube now because it's the era we live in.
Oh, in our great corporate commons.
Exactly.
That terrifying fact that we're sort of dependent on these things, which may disappear at any time.
At any minute, yeah. So, but they're really kind of fascinating. There's stuff on obviously political life, but the civil rights movement. There's a bunch of them that are done on strikes that are going on, specifically what was the Columbia strike, the students when they were occupying the buildings, like there were folks from the Newsreel Collective with them because they're not just filmmakers, they're also activists. So one of their newsreel documentaries is the Columbia strike from the point of view of we're in the buildings, we're, occupying the spaces there. So it's very immediate, like he says, kind of, in your face. I don't really like that phrase, but immediate, hey, this is what's going on style of putting stuff out. Also, just as a film history geek, calling it the newsreel, your collective harkens back to those past F.T.A. or the news on the march from Citizen Kane kind of thing. Like, hey, we're gonna get the word out there.
I think it's interesting because not there are not newsreels in the late 60s,
No,
but they're well within they're within the living memory of people who are at these protests.
oh yeah.
Even the students. So part of it is like I was just thinking like, how would you do this today? Be like, well, actually, it's just that we do that, right? We just do it on TikTok. But like, basically, I don't know. I was just thinking about what that would mean then.
Right. Well, also, if you're part of an organizing group or you're trying to organize a group, it gives you another tool that isn't just people making speeches at a coffee shop or a bar or a hall or, wherever people are gathering in these anti-war spaces in the late 60s. You have something that you can show that's like, here's documentary, proof of a topic or whatever to kind of get everybody that shared film experience, but also passing on a certain amount of information and knowledge. The Kramer and the Newsreel group and the collective in general was referencing a lot of not just what was going on in America in the late 60s, but like a worldwide perspective, especially third world struggles and things like that. Or as they called them, third world struggles, I guess. But if that's your film school, that's his film school, is basically what's going on here. He's learning the technical side of the trade from a specific kind of, propaganda, agitprop, provocative, style. Like he's not doing Hollywood narratives, which is interesting because it's also right in the middle of the new Hollywood movement. So you're getting a new type of filmmaking coming out within Hollywood, and he's never trying to go, as far as I read, like, let's go to Hollywood and pitch this story. He's just doing it.
Right.
So he moves away from newsreel, and his first production on his own is called In the Country, which stars a very young William Devane. I think it might be one of his first roles. It's like 55 minutes long. It's really fascinating. And it's just it's kind of a chamber piece of two formerly politically active, it's a couple, and it documents their, as it's described, like their descent into alienation, basically, in a country home. So there's a certain amount of wealth there, right? If they're like out at some country home. And it's just them just sort of ruminating on, like I said, like they're descended into alienation and they don't feel connected to the political process, to the political activism anymore in 1967.
Yeah, guys, it's a little early
for this. A little bit early.
I mean, once again, depending on if you come in, there's multiple different waves. You could have been involved in the anti-war movement. You could have been, sorry, in the civil rights movement, community organizing. I mean, it sounds like Kramer's that's interesting. Kramer's like a community organizer, SDS guy.
But then your first movie isn't like about an organization or diving into it. It's more like really wrestling with some of the ideas of like, is it worth it? Or, should I be, what did I, am I a failure? Whatever. What does it mean to have a campaign that's successful?
Yeah.
To be a successful organizer, that sort of thing.
Just wait for 68, guys. He'll be.
Well, in 68, he makes The Edge, which is I think a little bit of a step up production wise, but also really fascinating because it goes into it lays the groundwork for Milestones, I think, quite vividly. It opens with FBI looking profiles with like case numbers and images of people. And it's like it's at least 12, 13, 14 people speaking to multi-character, like large canvases of people here. And it's shot in the same documentary style that Milestones is, that In the Country is, that his early stuff is really shot. But it's immediate conversation. The first scene of dialogue is talking about why it's bad for the cause if this one member of their organization goes and kills the president. Like it just jumps right into it. And then that guy just can't get that. He's like, no, I have to. I feel like this is my purpose. And he goes around with his different friends at different levels of, kind of the hierarchy of organization. Some are casually into it. Some of them are like the actual organizers of stuff. And they just sort of debate this as he walks around. It's kind of like a hangout movie with within the organizational structure of the anti-war movement in 68. I believe it's all like New York City. I don't know if it actually says it or not, but it's a bit more like, I don't know, philosophical conversations of like, is that a good idea or is that a bad idea? What would happen to if you do? What would happen if you do? Why shouldn't you? Why should you? All this stuff. And it just ends up being an obsession for the main character. But you get a little bit more of a behind the scenes fictional look at, anti-war organizational structures in that one.
Wow. All right. Yeah. There's a lot of things to say about the New Left there. We don't need to get into all of it. Yeah.
But it's starting with FBI surveillance images and photos and stuff. I was like, well, okay, that's saying something too. Just, the awareness of like powers that be are watching us.
I mean, part of it, yeah, your post SDS weather underground meltdown mode is in the air. I mean, I think I don't not say that's what it is.
I was say last thing before you to Milestones, Ice. He does in 1970.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's like the natural progression.
It really is. Honestly, the natural progression would be In the Country, The Edge, and then Milestones, because Ice, my personal favorite of his, but it's also a science fiction movie. It takes place, so it's all about an underground revolutionary group that has some like internal strife, but you see like the step-by-step, moment-by-moment process where they are trying to build alliances. They're, trying to come up with a plan, but their plan is because in this one, it's a fictional fascist regime in the United States, really hard to imagine in 1970, right? But in this case, it's a war against Mexico. And so it sets up like a vaguely science fiction thing, but it's science fiction. Well, it has some Alphaville vibes. I know, one of your favorites, Godard, in that it's doing science fiction on such a micro budget. It's not doing like tech stuff or anything like that. It's just science fiction in that the political world of ice is not what it actually was in 1970. That's probably the better way to say it.
But it's actually supposed to convey that, right? So like the meltdown mode I was talking about, the guerrilla warfare moment, whatever, like the sort of late 60s movements as things, frustration comes to a boil, Black Power, obviously, the Black Panthers, but then also sort of so part of it is I actually see like two diverging branches then. So he's already very early on exploring the sort of like sense of, disarticulation from the movement and the sense of like disorientation. And at the same time going the other direction to the most militant possible view at that moment.
That's
And I've actually this is the first of his movies that I've seen. I haven't seen those other ones. And I sort of I really want to watch them to see if there's threads between them. I mean, he's having a conversation here.
It is. I think that's why I like that quote he said, where, in the end, all of my films will just turn into one big film.
Yeah.
But I think you're right. The two different kind of like that, the dichotomy there being ice and probably milestones next to each other are probably, like you said, highlighting the most there. Yeah. I kept thinking if you watch Ice, I kept thinking of Uptight, one of our favorites from 68. The way that one, the plan is one thing at the beginning of the movie, and then after like the heist of weapons gone wrong, you get a whole different movie with Uptight. This is one that's exploring like, what if they had those weapons? But not from a militant Black Power perspective. Although the Black Power movement is actually represented in Ice, not as a main character, but that, that's around, and alliances need to be sort of thing. And, what happens if that is forged or not.
So let's, before we jump into our deeper discussion of the film itself.
Yeah.
We have a special guest. Actually is a long time coming from the way back in the fabled summer of the 60s in 2020, where Jim Miller, my dad, kept showing up, not literally on the podcast, but it's like, oh, you're doing Monterey Pop? Yeah, he's actually not on frame, but he's like just a little over the over to the side. Oh, medium cool. Yeah, he was shared an office with Wexler.
Right.
Oh, you're talking about
about Barbarella and Jane Fonda.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, no, he slept on Jane Fonda's couch as part of the anti-war movement. Like, he just my dad, Jim Miller, just kept showing up. And I sort of wanted to get him on the podcast then, but I didn't really pull it off. So he did watch this movie. And so we do have some of his comments on the film to a certain degree, but especially on his own organizing at this time.
Yeah, because he's able to speak to what organizing was like in the moment, and also leading up to Milestones, specifically because you have a movie here now about what's next, I guess. As you pointed out, all these characters are at a milestone point in their life. Where do they go now? And Jim's really good at kind of setting the stage for like what was the organizing space and the folks doing right as Milestones is about to become a film.
Well, part of it is also like specifically to a very different organizing space within the anti-war than the people we're seeing in this movie.
Yeah. Some of them.
Some of them. Yeah. Well, we'll get into this.
We will get into that. Yeah. So here is our conversation with Jim, aka Isaac's dad.
We started a little bit before we started recording talking about the documentary F.T.A, which talks about, basically organizing, peace movement organizing within the active duty military. And I guess I wanted to ask about, so post, basically starting in 1973, when the U.S. military moves the last of its troops out, more or less. I mean, we could advisors, whatever, but like, basically, major combat operations are over. What sort of work were you doing? What sort of work was the peace movement doing? What effect did that have on it?
Well, there was an organization called Indochina Peace Campaign, which was focused really on cutting the very heavy, substantial financial and military support for the regime in Saigon, the U.S.-backed government in Saigon and in South Vietnam, and it was not easy to be talking about this because most people's attention had really shifted off of Indochina. In fact, they were glad to shift off Indochina. It was just not only us, but people who had served there or whatever didn't want to think about this place anymore. Well, I had been a conscientious objector and assigned to Cleveland, and I worked in the hospital laundry for 2 years, and which was pretty much physically the hardest job I ever
I
had.
bet.
And after that, I had a series of smaller jobs in the Cleveland area nearby where I was living because I didn't wasn't making enough money to have a car, but I would continue to be involved in the Indochina Peace Campaign now because I've been focused on Indochina and reading things about it going back to the early 60s and like 60 and 61 and so on. So we really tried to organize and reach people and have them throughout, in our case, in Ohio, because Ohio was one of the centers of organizing on this, to really go into even small towns and say, when your congressperson shows up, bring this up as an issue.
Mhm.
It actually had an effect because the congressman wasn't hearing anything about this, and here's people in this little town talking about it. Well, you got to do a lot of organizing to make something like that happen.
Yeah.
You got to travel all over the state and also be persuasive to people. So we were doing that work, and it was having an effect on the cutting amount of the money that was going in. So we were doing that work. I think we did a national demonstration at Kent State, on the fourth anniversary of the shootings at Kent State.
Mhm.
And of course, in Cleveland were very important in getting that together. It was just like trying to get people there. And I think we ended up getting at least 10,000 people because there were some, prominent people, and we had veterans of the Vietnam War and people who've actually been in Cambodia and everything. We had them all speak because we wanted to get into the national news, which was very difficult at that point to get any coverage. And we did get some. It wasn't easy, but we got some. And it probably had, even that activity had some influence.
Sure.
By the time the war ended, people really, aside from a few people that had a long-term connections, but I'm talking a few, like
Mhm.
10, 12, whatever, to Vietnam, really, it sort of broke. And in a way, the people who were the anti-war people didn't really do the long-term work of explaining the war the way they should have, because that led to the right wing doing this whole story of Vietnam and how the GIs were betrayed and how they were hated and so on, which was completely a false story. And when you watch the film F.T.A., if you can see it online or whatever, you'll see that just how false that is just
Yeah.
by watching what's going on in this film, which is, it's a documentary, so it's shot right on the scene. Anyway, so that's what we were doing in terms of anti-war movement in those key years. But most people who were activists had shifted. For instance, there was a great deal of growth in the women's movement, and there was a lot of work on environmental issues. And there in Cleveland, and I was involved, there was a lot of work on housing and tenant organizing and a whole range of things like that. And people were glad to get off of the war. And then, of course, when it ended in 75, they were really glad. That's the kind of organizing was going on. And I was trying to keep my enough food coming in so I could continue to pay my $80 a month at the house I was living in. So that's what was going on in 75 for me. Well, it's not every personal
Well,
thing
right.
that's going on.
But that's a good preface to go into Milestones, because in this one, Robert Kramer and his co-director John Douglas are using the aesthetics of a documentary, handheld camera work and, shooting in real locations, looking at some of the folks that maybe didn't, like you said, shift over to women's liberation or environmental activism. These characters to me just kind of felt a little bit more adrift.
Right.
And like Isaac had mentioned, not really clearly the focus of the movie isn't necessarily on their organizing. It's more on like, I don't know, is it their lives post organizing or just
Well, that's something I think we're going to be discussing
yeah.
throughout the episode, is exactly where these people are at. And for me, it's sort of what type of organizational structure they're in.
It doesn't seem like people who were like key organizers or something like that. It just
Sure.
sounds, this is the people that probably, when you say you got 50,000 people or you got 10,000,
Mhm.
they're there in the crowd and they've talked to friends and said, why don't you come? It's that kind of level that seems to be there. And then, of course, people are involved in a number of things, but also just the counterculture. This obviously that you're talking about people that are, interested in the various, drugs and so on that were important part of the culture, pot and so on, and also music and just everything that was going on. Obviously,
Yeah.
people's life, they're not all built around that. And there was a lot going on and a lot of shifts going on, and a very strong conservative movement in the country as well. So we've got the Reagan years approaching and all that stuff. So, or having already approached.
So I don't mean to disagree with my dad, which never happens.
Oh, I think it has happened.
Uh,
Anyway.
but I think these are more core organizers than it seems.
Mm,
Got somebody who's getting out of jail from helping resistors, and that's more than people. I think the people who show up, like Return of the Secaucus 7, is people who show up, who sort of showed up to protest. This
yeah,
You've got one person who went into industry, right? He went to work in Detroit as a radical.
right,
And
right.
his problem is that his organization fell apart outside while he was doing the work in the factory. So I feel like they're deeper in than that.
Well, I think you're both right, because there's like 50 characters in this movie.
Right.
Like
Yeah.
it's massive. So I think there are some, like you said, that were there in the crowd to support or invited by a friend or whatever. But then there are also some characters that were a little bit deeper in the organization.
I was watching it and sort of trying to puzzle that sort of thing out.
Hmm.
It wasn't that easy to do because this was not your standard documentary, where you're explaining things as you go along. This is one where you have to puzzle it out yourself.
Yeah.
Who is who is this? Now, when you're looking at people, it's not like they're taking people from 20 years later and they're playing people from 20 years before.
Right.
So that makes it very different. And it also means that people may not really feel the need to explain everything about them because isn't it obvious what I'm doing here?
Right.
You know, everybody here in the room knows this, you know, so. But I know about this film that, I mean, I never heard of it before. And so I was involved in the anti-war movement in 75 and I never heard of this film. So it obviously never showed around where I was. It didn't, you know, it didn't get any exposure as far
Yeah.
as I, and you didn't have the internet in the way that where things could get out, you know, not in a physical form and in a theater or
Right.
whatever. So I never heard of it.
Well,
You
I know
know,
his Kramer's previous film he did in 1970 called Ice. That's a bit more of a process within an organization on how they're organizing and resisting, but it's also fictional, technically speaking, and all that. But that film was kind of denied release through the networks that he had when he was working with the Newsreel Cooperative and
yeah,
getting, those short films out. So I don't know if maybe he had burned some bridges or there were some people like, well, we're not going to screen that or help kind of get the word out on Milestones. Also, it, over 3 hours long and
right,
it's a commitment and it's clearly an independent production. So yeah, it definitely was not widely seen
right.
when it came out.
Oh, it's sort of amazing to look at it now because it is sort of like you're there.
Yeah.
It's kind of impressive that this film exists now
Yeah.
and that you can see it. But I think in showing it, people really should get some kind of context for it because most people, like 99%, are going to find it hard to figure out what's going on and why are they talking and why am I looking at this and
Yeah.
what is this? You know?
Yeah. It feels very, very of the moment and kind of a fictional time capsule of the moment that's not entirely fictional.
Yeah. But there's no voice telling you, well, this is now what's happening.
Right.
Let's see what they say. Well, you don't really have that. You have to do that yourself,
Yeah.
which is not easy to
No,
do.
no, no. Which is it's an interesting way to put a film together too, because it's demanding your attention the whole way through. You can't
Yeah.
just kind of passively watch this one.
I mean, are these people you recognize at any level?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, of course, you're always thinking like when you're working in a movement, you're thinking about specific people, and it's not like, oh, this is somebody in this category or something. It isn't like that. But I recognize them as being people that. So in 75, I would have been 29. So I was roughly the age of a number of these people, I would
Mhm.
think, would seem like, and going through some of the same things. But I think I'd have to watch it two or three more times.
Maybe treat it more like a TV show. Break it up a little bit.
Episodic. Yeah.
Right, right. Well, I mean, commercially, to have a 3 hour movie that doesn't, it breaks between the three. I guess one of them seems like it's Arizona or I don't know exactly where it is, New Mexico.
Mhm.
The other two settings, and you could sort of tell that you've cut. After a while, you figure that out.
Right.
You figure, oh yeah, there's three different places, but it takes a while to figure that out. But is the filmmaker, is he still, are they still around? I mean,
No, he died in 99.
oh,
Yeah.
okay.
So I think that provides a really great bit of context. Once again, as I mentioned on our Palestinian films episode, I wish I would have had that conversation with your dad before watching the movie myself. I think that would have definitely infused my screening of it. It is over 3 hours long. Did you do it all in one block?
No.
Were you watching it with your dad?
I watched it with both of my parents. My mom actually has our most precise critic, but I watched it with both of them, and we split it up basically the first 2 hours and the last hour and 20.
Okay.
And I mean, part of it is it's long, but there's a lot of long movies these days because the art of editing seems to be dead. But this is not a movie. I think for some people this might go quickly. For me, I was just like, oh, I mean, when it's hard to follow the narrative, it feels longer.
Yeah, I joked on our previous episode that having seen Ice and been aware of Robert Kramer's stuff, I was like, oh, I think it's going to fly by. It did not for me, and I don't mean that in a bad way. As far as a film, I don't think there's anything you could really edit out because everything's there for a reason. I think, and like you said, it's not like it's in need of a better editor. Like both John Douglas and Kramer are the editors here. I think they know exactly what they're doing, but you're also committing to watch, a 3 hour plus, avant-garde experimental kind of film. But it has enough trappings, almost like that Robert Altman comparison from the top of the show, where it it's close to being a standard narrative film.
Mm.
I don't think it would be the same. It would not be the same film. I don't think I would like it as much as it did either. But also, think of 1975, the pop or rock soundtrack you could put to this, the more conventional editing style, which Robert Kramer was very much like, no, I'm not doing that. That's not what I'm interested in. Could be there to maybe elevate this more to a Secaucus 7 level. I don't know. I kept in my head thinking Secaucus 7 and then even worse, The Big Chill as I was watching this one, even though this one is of the moment and those two are looking back on the moment.
Well, Secaucus 7 is not looking back on the moment. Secaucus 7 is about
when it's filmed.
Yeah, it's about the late 70s, and it's about, I think I sort of jumped in on my dad. I mean, I think my dad's immediate reaction sort of comes from Secaucus 7 to a certain degree, but also because he wasn't really seeing their organizing on screen. But Secaucus 7 really is about people who probably went to all the protests but didn't organize any of them. I adore Secaucus 7 and fuck The Big Chill. But like this is people who I think are, I don't know if they're organizing protests, but they're more deeply in it. There's nobody who's overtly an anarchist, but this is the place within the movement today that these people will be in would be the anarchist part of it.
Yeah.
And I think that's part of the difference with my dad is that my dad is very much in Marxist, but sort of neo-social democratic. I mean, he ended up in the New American Movement, which is one half of what became DSA.
Okay.
So that sort of gives you, that will be the part of, so the other half was DSOC, which was sort of part of the old Socialist Party, or, Reed, and NAM was the more communists, but sort of like people who come out of the new left to a certain degree. And so they formed DSA in the early 80s. And so he's in sort of a more, I mean, actually, I shouldn't say this because I think in some ways, probably these were people who were part of organizations which were maybe in some ways at some of the tightness of what he's talking about, but that doesn't exist anymore. Their organizing spaces feel like what, you would call an affinity group.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I can see that.
And that's what it feels like, is that this is an affinity group or a series of affinity groups that are sort of like fragmented as people have gotten older and are tired. I mean, the other big difference with my dad and the people in this movie, along with, I mean, my dad is like, into countercultural things, but that's not what he's there for. So he's never going to a commune. He's never doing that sort of thing. The personal is not as political for him.
Right.
But the other element is that, I mean, I think, he's going to protest throughout, like at least in the second half of the 60s. But I think a lot of these people probably have been organizing for 10 years or more by the time this movie comes around. And I think my dad is hitting his stride into the 70s. So they're hitting a particular moment in the life cycle of movements.
Is it worth, as we jump into this film, even trying to wrap up with a synopsis? What is going on here, other than what we've kind of already mentioned or hinted at, that it's just this huge, sprawling, multi-character look at kind of the new left and adjacent people in a post-Vietnam America. The basic description you get on Letterboxd or IMDb is that there's 6 storylines with more than 50 characters exploring lifestyles and attitudes, which I think is about as good as you're going to get as far as a quick description goes.
Sure is. Yeah, I mean, I do it. Go for it.
That was it. That's what I got.
I that's the description. That's the whole thing.
I took down notes and I have stuff in front of me, but like I did not get like I was trying to get character names at first, but that doesn't really help either. A lot of folks, the act like if you go through the actors in here on IMDb or on Letterboxd, this is predominantly this is their only credit. So either locals that Kramer and Douglas found or knew, or people that they did know that wanted to do a part, or people that they knew like, oh, so and so, we know them out on this particular commune. Let's go see if we can film out there. Let's talk to them. Let's see if they'll be down with this project. Looks like presumably they were, because these are not sets that were created. They went to actual people and locations and filmed.
How many of these people are actors and how many people are his buddies or both?
That Venn diagram is probably almost a circle. I'm guessing.
I mean, one of them, my dad figured this out. One of them is Joe Stork, who later on becomes a sort of left-wing Middle East expert.
And he has one credit on Letterboxd, so this is it.
This is it.
Yeah.
This is what gets it. He's hanging out with his buddies doing this.
It really feels like a collecting all of your resources together. As we've been saying, like the build up as far as his film career goes, from In the Country to The Edge to Ice to this movie, it's just such a natural progression and expansion of what he's doing, including the Newsreel Collective that he's doing, at the start of his film career.
Right.
So it does seem like cashing in all those favors you can get from your buddies.
Yeah. So it's really hard to do. I mean, we could look at particular strands or certain particular characters. I mean, I think one of the things that I like is that some of these interpersonal relationships are so well shown. I think about the couple with the kid who have left the commune, and they're just driving around throughout most of the movie. They're meeting up with some people, they're meeting up with others. There's one point where they inexplicably have another kid with them toward the end of the movie, and then they bring that kid back to their parents. It's like
when the car breaks down.
Yeah, and it's not, we don't see when they get this other kid. It's, like, one of their friends. Presumably it's to hang out with their kid. I mean, it's the closest they get to a play date. I mean, it's not really clear.
We're just doing a favor, keeping an eye on somebody's kid while they're doing something.
But what's interesting about it is, you really get you get with a number of I mean, actually, I think that the characters with children, and there's another major set to jump onto, are really interesting because it looks into communal childcare.
Yeah.
And the strengths and the difficulties under the context in which only within your community does this exist. So like they're trying to transition out of the commune, and they're like kind of all over the place, right? Like, I mean, they get into a fight in which he won't show his emotions. She wants him to show some emotions. It's not that she wants him to do a thing. She wants him to acknowledge what is happening, and he is in pure survival mode.
Yeah.
Because they're running out of money. They're on the road. They desperately need community. It's just that it's so clear how much the autonomous couple, the ideal, right, of the autonomous couple and the child doesn't work.
Right.
Certainly for them. They've been used to, in many ways, really operate with this stuff at a communal level, including both with their relationship where they don't have to depend completely on each other, and where they don't have to depend on each other to raise their child, and suddenly they have to, and it is wrenching.
Yeah.
And then there's the other couple. One of them's this sort of new age acupuncturist. We see her at the beginning. And then the other one is the guy who used to work with like fish in a lab and now isn't. And he's now, his kid is 5 now, and he wants to be involved in raising. He's enjoying raising, but part of it,
this guy, I remember. Yeah.
Neither of them have really been operating as parents. They've been sort of allowed their kids to be sort of communally raised, and that seems to have worked really well. There's multiple, we never see this, but there's apparently multiple different, groups of, members of their community who have raised this kid while they went off and did other things, saw the kid, but like didn't really act as parents. Right. Now he wants to be the dad when the kid's 5, which, I mean, you're a parent. This is a developmentally kind of a fun age.
Oh, yeah.
Now that you don't have to change diapers, you want to jump on board, huh?
Yeah, 4 to 9's kind of my favorite because they're up for anything. Well, my kids were. It's pretty fun. And that's how they portrayed in this movie as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, pure
What's that?
fast.
That's when we even get like the trip to the zoo, right? With the group.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
when we get the zoo, and it's a whole group of them then.
Great group dynamic. Yeah. With other kids there too.
And so part of you got this weird thing where there's the tensions within the communal thing, and he's not like totally against it, but like where it's like, all right, now you want to jump on and do something that's a little bit more conventional, or play a more prominent role, but like are you being selfish by not having looked after your kid because your kid was fine? It's not like you're sticking them in foster care even, right? Like
Right.
you're
Right.
sticking them in a different type of family. But now you want to like get in there a little bit more. Like, is that guy an asshole? I don't know.
I didn't read it that way, but I guess you maybe could. It seemed like the point of life he is now is like, oh, this actually is something I want in my life. So maybe Ted is selfish the right way to describe that? Because it's his needs, not the kid's needs necessarily that he's thinking about there.
That's the thing,
Yeah.
right? Like at no point, it's like, I mean, he's really enjoying hanging out with his kid and like playing that role of science dad.
Yeah.
And that's great. But like, does this really work? And so it's the mother who also doesn't seem to have raised the kid really, who has to point out, is like, well, or has been involved in raising, but has not, has done this communally. Is like, well, it's not really up to us. There's like a whole community that has to decide how this kid needs to be raised because that's what we decided to do.
Hmm.
So she's actually calling for sort of stability in the kid's life, which is seems to be what's important. It's just very interesting watching those discussions.
Hmm. Because also
Um,
you're not if it was in a typical say like Hollywood or Nashville framework, it'd be like who's right or who's wrong, or it's just presenting. It's
yeah.
just here's the scene, here are the dynamics at play. Let's see how this plays out for a little bit. And then, after 5 minutes, we cut to the next scene. And then after 5 minutes, we jump to somebody else.
Was there another strand that really jumped out at you?
Honestly, it kind of not. I was never bored by any of them. I found them all kind of fascinating and like I know it's a documentarian, but like in a Frederick Weissman, also probably the running time, like Frederick Weissman makes, 3 hour plus documentaries where you're with usually a social institution of some sort is where he documents stuff. And you were just with all of these different characters in this particular movie. Nothing was like, I never was like, oh, good, we're back to that thread, but I wasn't bored by any of them either. I thought they were all fascinating, but more of I don't know, more of like an experimental anthropological kind of way than like I'm really engaged with these characters kind of way, except for maybe the potter, the guy that does the pottery, the blind man. Not to just call him out by being blind, but I don't have a character name in front of me for that one.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think we were saying, all right, I'm full credit where credit's due. I think my mom was the one who pointed this out to me. Is for her, and I agree, is he's one the most sympathetic character in some ways, and he's the most sort of community building one. He does draw people in.
Yeah. And even early on in 3 hours, I think it's at like the 45, maybe hour minute mark where him just arriving on the scene because he has a friend that's coming by to visit, he stops a sexual assault from happening.
Right.
But he's also a blind man with a cane who stops it, so he doesn't actually witness and can't help necessarily identify anybody
Right.
if they were going to go that route. But luckily he's there, so it's almost there's like kind of an interesting hero moment for this guy as well.
And I think you pointed this out. Here he's a gay character in 1975 in which this is just a matter of life, like everything else in the movie.
Yes.
Not commented on. No other character commented on. No one is uncomfortable with it. Nobody, whatever, right? Like,
It just is.
yeah,
And that's not how general Hollywood was doing gay characters. They first of all they would be probably a bit more coded, but you're a few years out from Midnight Cowboy, so like you do have some interesting, I don't know, very realistic portrayals. But this one is actually it's not like Midnight Cowboy's probably a terrible example because like that ends horribly for everybody involved in that particular story. But this is just a dude living his life.
yeah, no, absolutely, no. They're not really coded at all. And the other guy is specific. Well, the dad who I was just mentioning, there's a scene where there's a Vietnam vet character who attempts a burglary and gets shot, and the the dad character just comes to the room and like sits on their bed and like isn't wearing clothes because everybody's used to commune living basically,
Yeah.
and like nobody they really have broken down the social mores to a large degree. At the same time, so one of the things I'm gonna take this directly from my mom's analysis. This is the episode of my parents, I guess. Well, because I was back for the holidays, so I was
Yeah.
watching. So we have character who, so we can tell a lot of their organizing seems to have been sort of helping deserters,
Yeah.
which is illegal. And so one of them has gone to jail, and so it's his sort of journey outside of it. The degree to which this community badly bungles supporting him is incredible,
Yeah.
actually. And part of what's funny is they have somebody in their circle, like peripheral to the circle, because the person who seemed to have been close to him, who picks him up from jail, is also working on a pamphlet basically with with a woman who has been in jail on, basically what dealing with the legal system. But she's the one who picks him up and they seem to have no idea none of them, they were so ashamed that he was the one who went to jail that people weren't I mean, I don't know, it's not clear if she was visiting him, but the rest of the group didn't visit
Was
him
not.
while he
Right. Yeah, there's just no jail support here at all.
there's no jail support. And then the first thing you do is, oh, we want to have a party and get everybody together. And
Which I get, that's a their instinct thing because you're like, oh, hey, our buddy's back, but also like you need to check with someone to see if that's what they want to do.
he's been in a sensory deprivation chamber. Well, no, in a very complicated alien social environment. He's now getting out. And when he sort of indicates that that's not what he wants to do, she doesn't really listen.
Mm-mm.
And then when he gets there, his apartment or whatever had been like burnt, like most of his stuff is gone. And everybody's offering to let him stay with them. Like everybody offers, but everybody in this movie is trying to get people to stay with them. The number of times somebody, would you like to live with me? Like everybody's trying to, part of the
We
thing
just
is,
stay here for a little bit. Oh, we got a spot for you right over. Yeah, it's that and well, I feel like I kind of feel like
yeah.
it's like the two most overheard bits of dialogue in this movie.
I mean, you feel like they're all scattering and they're desperately trying to, it's like, do you want to build community around me? I desperately need community. You want community around me? I'm desperate for community.
Yeah.
But it's the Potter who actually connects with him at a
Yeah.
human by just not putting pressure on him.
Yeah. Just I'm here.
Let's be chill,
Yeah.
let's make some pots.
Yeah. Including the scene where there's almost like the destroying, like, don't they just destroy a bunch of pots they're working on and just like there's something cathartic about just like smashing up that clay.
Yeah. Well, one of them has a flaw when he's done with it, and it's like, oh, well, we'll just start over. Let's just make another one.
But it's like a joyous moment that they're sharing together when they're just like mashing all this clay. Since we're looking specifically at a Robert Kramer film here, we probably also need to mention the filmmaker character in this particular movie that's the Helen character, right?
Who's the mother of several of the other characters, and we get sort of an interesting intergenerational view.
Well, before we jump into that, like you mentioned with Joe Stork, this character in the movie is played by Grace Paley or Paley. I'm not sure how you pronounce the last name there. Who's short story author, poet, teacher, activist, et cetera, et cetera. So this is not, again, not going to professional actors, going to people, poets, artists, activists that presumably Kramer and Douglas are fans of or friends with. But when you're casting someone to be the filmmaker in your movie, and you are a filmmaker too, there's something going on there.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. I mean, she's the most famous person in the movie, I think.
Could be, yeah.
But it's, she's got two daughters in it, and we get to see one of them have live birth at the end of the movie.
We do. But as you're watching the movie too, there's like people directly addressing the camera all of a sudden. Because some of it is you're seeing her film that she's making, but then there's also times where we're just hanging out with like her and one of her daughters talking that I don't think is part of her film. It was an interesting way to blur the lines because there's never like as your I think your dad referenced, like there aren't title cards on screen saying what location you're at now or what this character's name is or what's going on. And luckily there's no like terrible exposition dialogue of I'm going to go visit my daughter and I just got to finish my most recent film.
Right.
But I think we're seeing some footage of her work.
One could argue there's certain types of clunky dialogue in this, but that is not it.
No. But like you said, with multi-generational generations of women here in this situation too, you get different ideas of motherhood that are really fascinating.
I think motherhood is such an important theme throughout the movie because we start with an older woman who we only see once, who's not part of this community at all. She's like an older Italian New Yorker. You know, she's probably, God, she could be in her 80s. I'm trying to figure out. She has a time. You can figure out her timeline by her age, by when she got married, roughly.
Mm-hmm.
And she's talking to two of the other women who we'll see throughout the movie, just talking about her life. And one of them basically is like relating, saying relating to her as a mother, that she's relating to her as a mother in a way that she couldn't relate with her own mother. And you can tell the older woman actually, like, there's a certain sympathy for the mother, and for the mother who is not in the scene and not seen the movie. It's sort of like, well, do you talk to her at all? It's sort of, but it's like it opens with this sort of like the nature of sort of female generational experience.
Yeah, because she's talking about being like a seamstress in Manhattan. I wrote down in my notes. She says she was born in 1891, so that gives you a sense of when she was going to be a seamstress in Manhattan. So yeah, you get a different, generational experience there. Don't they also have I think there's a little bit of footage of her towards the end of the movie
Yeah.
too. Okay. Because I remember thinking the bookends that I kind of wanted, which is not a knock on the film at all, was, if you're starting off with this woman in the West Village walking around talking about her early life in Manhattan and what it was like to be a woman at that point in time, and then at the one of the final scenes of the movie, you see a live birth on camera. What a great poetic bookend that is, of like, woman near the end and then the beginning of life at the end of the movie, which is there. It's just not like the actual like last image of the movie, but that is a really interesting bookend, I think, to have for this sprawling narrative.
Yeah. It's a very interesting bookend. There's Here's the thing, and I realize this is a film podcast, so we should not be like, we're supposed to have fully digested the film before.
Ooh, I this is a tough one.
Well, I feel like the last one was a tough one too. But no, this is a very tough one to fully digest. I mean, I feel like this happens sometimes I mean, I certainly get a lot. I mean, I get a lot out of discussing these movies with you, Aaron. But like, this is one of these ones where I'm gonna end up liking it a lot more. I like it a lot more because we've discussed it.
Yeah, yeah, me too. I mean, it's a strong recommend, but it's like I said, 6 storylines. All of the reviews and writing on this was like, over 50 characters. It's a lot, but it's also not some convoluted like Christopher Nolan mystery puzzle plot. It's just kind of, presents artistic representations of just day-to-day life as it was for people in 1975, or a specific kind of group of people in 75. And it drops you right in all of these moments. It's not building to some grand payoff where everything overlaps and intersects at like one big organizational, protest or commune or sit in or anything like that. It's just kind of, here is a large swath of life and human existence and experience.
Yeah, no, exactly. And I mean, I'm trying to, the culminating event of the movie is the childbirth.
Right, but I meant like narratively, it's not telegraphed or like, oh, we're building up to this like, oh,
Yeah.
the birth is going to be the end of the movie. Like, it's discussed on the way to the end, but it's also one of those movies I didn't know. Like, there's not like trailers out for this movie. This is not a widely well-known movie from the 70s. I didn't know that childbirth scene was coming at the end, and then I was like, okay, we're going to be showing all of this.
Yeah, we're doing
That
the whole
grabs
thing.
you narratively and also just as a film. Like, it is compelling. And you see an entire community together to support someone in, one of the most awesome moments you can have in your life. Pretty spectacular.
Yeah. No, I would agree. I mean, it's sort of it's a stunner of a moment. So like there's two of them where you can tell there's two threads where like they seem to be still active. One is the one that I mentioned before where they're putting together a pamphlet on jail support, which has an interesting moment about what it's like or not jail support, but like the criminal justice system,
Yeah.
where they've been working on this pamphlet for like 9 months, and they go back and one sounds exactly, it in some ways it sounds very modern. It's very sort of recognizable, but it's also just that things haven't changed as much as you think.
Yeah.
But the one is just like, this is horrible. I feel so detached from what I do. I mean, we haven't really talked about this, but like, I think for the person for a figure who got out of jail, and some of the other ones, there's sort of detachment and unsureness about what they're doing. And presumably this is because the anti-war movement is over, because not the anti-war movement is over, but like the parts of it they were. Well, it is actually now. It really is over in a lot
Well,
of
you said
ways.
like the mass movement of it is, yeah.
Yeah, the mass movement of it is over, and I mean the Indochina peace camp. I mean, actually, now it really in '75 it really is ended, right?
Yeah.
Like stuff my dad is talking about is ending. It's done. Like the North has won. But she's looking at this pamphlet they've been working on 6 months, and she's just so fucking sick of it, and that resonates. But there's the other guy who went into industry. Do you know what that term?
Oh, yeah, yeah. When he goes to his dad, who's a doctor.
No.
Not that guy.
That's the guy. He's the guy who's a factory worker in Detroit.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And so part of it, he went into industry. So that means he, along with a bunch of other radicals, he went in to basically do radical work within the labor movement, right?
Right.
And they've just lost an election, right, as reformers, which like doesn't mean they're bad organizers. It's pretty hard to do this.
Yeah.
And he talks, but he's active, except that the people who helped to send him in there in the first place, that group doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
Sort of he's been doing this work for all this time, and he's kind of stranded there, and he has this option to go live with some of his other friends, but he doesn't want to abandon that work. I mean,
Right.
he's a factory worker. That's what he is now.
Yeah.
And it's a parallel. Do you remember Finally Got the News?
Yeah. The documentary.
That's so when he talks about sort of he says, I mean, this is in 75, so this is, I don't think, drum doesn't exist anymore. So the people in Finally Got the News, I mean, things, but no, he sort of talks about how the black workers are so much more organized in Detroit, right? And at a community level and so forth, in doing this sort of radical work. So the other people in the factory, hypothetically, would be the drum people.
Right.
That's in some ways who he's on the line with. So I think he's an interesting figure of like, I mean, he's one of these people, he's like a stranded organizer, but now you just keep going.
Yeah.
Because workplace organizing is not like the anti-war movement. I mean, you can fight American imperialism for forever, and I hope we're all in the streets today against genocide in Palestine. But he's sort of a representation of a particular. I mean, it's I don't know. I found that very interesting.
It is because I think it also speaks to the interest, at least the film interest that Kramer had over the years here, the early part of his career, because he didn't make, in the country as people who feel disconnected because the movement is either not there with them anymore or they're not part of, like, it speaks to that level of alienation, I guess. Like, okay, he's doing that particular character is doing the work, but like the organization in which launched him into doing that work doesn't exist anymore. That can make you feel pretty cut off from maybe what your roots or you thought your roots were that were there. But like you said, there's still the work you've been doing for the years that you've been there, and that counts for something and is building something. So sucks not to have a support system, I guess, but at the same time, maybe your support system has shifted and now it's the folks that you're working with.
It's in the factory, right?
It's right there. Yeah.
I mean, it's one set of organizing can become a seedbed for another, but of course he does seem sort of aimless because he's not aimless.
Yeah, it's a good word. Yeah.
But he's a little, he is having trouble because he's the original external community that he was part of isn't there. And of course it's hard to do this sort of work in a union. I mean, it's the brutal organizing you can do.
It is.
So, yeah.
There's a thing you mentioned when we were talking about, again, Exterminating Angel. I think it's coming up a lot in my brain watching this one because we're watching back to back, movies made by leftists as well that are tackling a lot of themes. You'd mentioned the tone within the Exterminating Angel being that there is an active left within society and how that kind of infuses the film in a different way.
I mean, I didn't say it until the end, and the director is like a Marxist, but yeah.
Right. I was thinking about that a lot watching this one because it's almost like mourning the loss of the mass movement, as we were speaking with activism in the mid 70s here. There's a loss of that within society that it seems like Kramer might be kind of wrestling with in this one. That's kind of a direct commentary on what we were saying about Buñuel and Exterminating Angel. Just a thought. It just, I was thinking about it in that way just because you were saying how there was such it was in the culture around, previous movie we covered there. And then here it's not really around anymore, but it was just around.
Well, I mean, it goes back to our first episode.
Children of Men.
Children of Men episode, because I think part of the point there was that in the 60s and 70s, movements were assumed to be there.
Mm-hmm.
even in Hollywood movies, or as you get into new Hollywood at the very least, even if you don't handle them well, even if you are hostile toward them, it's just a thing that exists. There are people who are hijacking planes. There are potential strikes are normal.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, whatever. There's a this countercultural thing which may or may not be the movement itself. There's all this stuff, and that by the time the '80s happened, that's gone, and by the time Children of Men happens, which is a movie that does exist, it is that sort of movie. It's just totally gone, right? Like it doesn't exist, and we still haven't really gotten back to that. This is a movie from inside of that movement.
Right.
And so,
but it's also made by people from the movement too.
Right.
Which is interesting. Yeah.
It's purely from within it. So in some ways I mean, as much as Buñuel was in a sense part of movements or part of, like politically active.
Yeah.
He's also like a filmmaker, like in a big, capital letters sort of way.
Well, because I think he came to art and filmmaking first, it seems like.
Exactly.
And then whereas Kramer came up through an activist organizer participatory kind of role and like gravitated towards the art eventually.
Yeah.
So, but I also do kind of really respect the fact that Kramer eschews just celebratory works in his fictional film output. It's actually really critical in a lot of ways.
Oh,
the way it's portrayed. You know what I mean?
Such an important point. I mean, he actually, because you're saying with his newsreels work, his early work is propaganda, but none of these other movies, I mean, I haven't seen Ice, but it doesn't sound like any of these movies are propaganda.
I would have put him in that category. And that's his label for the newsreel collective. Like that wasn't me just saying whatever. And also propaganda doesn't necessarily mean always negative, but you know what I mean?
It's not negative at all. The movements need propaganda, but part of it is, I wonder how does that relate to how he's making sort of anti-propaganda through the rest of this. Does that relate?
Actually, it's interesting that you make that parallel, Isaac, between like maybe the work that was going on in newsreel and what he wanted to do. Well, one, you have a collective environment with a lot of people and a lot of things being produced. He wasn't like the mastermind behind it. It was over 60 some films. He was part of it, not like, leading a collective or anything like that. He was just working in there. He has a quote though from when he left newsreel, which I think maybe illustrates what you're talking about, like the split in the approach in production for newsreel versus the way his films are, propaganda versus not being propaganda. Robert Kramer says, it's the responsibility of revolutionaries to claim all the good things in the world in the revolution, not to make lives that rule it out, not to say you can't have beautiful films, for example. You can have beautiful films and be a revolutionary. It was an error of newsreel to believe that to proletarianize was to uglify.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going in with the newsreel crew and the idea is you want to polarize or anger or excite for the purposes of discussion, that's clearly not what he's doing. I don't think in his early fiction films that we're talking about here, specifically in Milestones. I don't think that's a polarizing, anger, exciting, propaganda style.
No. I mean, it's very much introspective of the places where movement life and counterculture. Counterculture. Yeah. Anyway,
your favorites.
Sorry, but where movement life has taken you in your life,
mm-hmm.
Right?
Yeah.
As opposed to the organizing aspect, and then, I mean, so part of it is, I mean, so much of it is it the movement speaking to itself? Is the fact that he's starting, I mean, he starts so early with alienation. Is he so alienated by the fact of doing propaganda and this sort of artificialness of that? I mean, proletarianizing in the most artificial way, right?
Yeah.
I mean, what's proletarian about it?
I mean, I guess your eventual cause once the discussions get going and, film as jumping off point, maybe, but.
I mean, politically, I mean, he's not somebody who like turned into a Reaganite or something.
No. He he left the United States in I think 79 and spent the rest of his days making movies in France. So I don't know. Maybe the early films, as we're mentioning, like his first fiction film, In the Country, being a couple who feel political alienation from the culture and the activist community that they're in. Then we have a gentleman who exiles himself to France and continues a film and political career through the 80s.
Yeah.
Well, I mentioned early on that there was a great quote of his that I found. I put it in the doc as kind of like the ending wrap up theme because I really liked that Kramer said this. This is later on in his life, when he was living and working in France. But he said, eventually, all these movies I make will make up one long film, one quote story in a continuous process of becoming. The detailed account of a consciousness moving through time and place, trying to survive, to understand, trying to find an appropriate home, and throughout it all, living with images, with the film form as one continuous practice that unifies the project. That definitely seems like someone looking back on their career, obviously, but I think that also like he's dead on, at least in the stuff that I've seen from his early first 4 or 5 films. They're independently interesting, but they are all having conversations with each other, which is kind of a fascinating oeuvre to have. A consciousness moving through time and place, trying to survive, trying to understand. Kind of speaks to a little bit of an alienation feeling.
Yeah,
too.
he sounds alienated from the very people and movements that have made him.
Yeah.
And that he's so engrossed in. And so he's working through his alienation through this by looking at how alienated everybody. And, he's both in it and outside of it, right?
Because my impression is he moved a bit more into like the filmmaking aspect than maybe the activism and organizing aspect at a certain point too.
Yeah. But yeah, when did that happen?
Exactly. But I think we know the answer to this one. Is this a leftist film, Isaac?
Yes. We don't even need to discuss that. Yeah.
I love that when the answer is yes. It's just like, yeah, duh. Anyway, next.
Yeah. Well, sometimes we have to work through some deep calculation spins.
Sometimes it's a little wishy-washy, and sometimes it's a little gray. Not here. Solid recommend. You do need to watch it. I would say hopefully we were able to get you some good context for it. I don't think we had even said the word spoiler this whole episode for once. There isn't really a way to spoil this film. I guess maybe the live birth part, if you didn't know that was in there, but it's still a wow kind of scene and, builds to it. I don't necessarily think it's a spoiler, so to speak, but it's also super, super hard to find. There's an old Janus Films DVD. I think it has Milestones and Ice both on it. But if you head over to either Solidarity Cinema or archive.org, have a good number of Robert Kramer stuff up there. So it's findable.
I got this on what is it, Ovid?
Oh, I don't think I know that one.
Yeah, Ovid's like a streaming service that's sort of, actually, you should check it out. It's more documentary oriented and it's more leftist in some ways.
Okay. Wait, I downloaded and then put it in our drive for you to watch, and you didn't even use that file?
I couldn't get it on the TV screen. Normally I would have used that.
Okay. I was like, because there was The Edge was in there and Ice and In the Country.
Yeah, I'm gonna watch those. I'm gonna watch those that way.
Gotcha.
Now I don't have a TV, I don't have room for a TV. But when I'm at my parents' place, I watch it on TV, and I don't really want to do it any other way.
Well, when you have access to a TV and not your computer, that's definitely a step up for watching. But
yes.
Anyway, yeah, mandatory viewing. Need to watch it. Ideally, like I said, we gave some good context. If you can watch it with a group, I think it'll get some interesting conversations going because some people are going to respond to other segments that you maybe aren't responding to. It's a good piece that, as Robert Kramer even said, it's meant to get some discussion going. I think he would appreciate that. What's our part 2 film, Isaac? Continuing our look at post-Vietnam.
Well, we're going straight into documentary land. Yes.
Woo!
Isaac is doing documentaries. What can I say? And we're going to be looking at 1972's F.T.A. Fuck the Army, which is which my dad, I believe, brought up in his interview, which is a documentary about starring Jane Fonda and Donald Sutherland, along with a lot of anti-war vets, showing their anti-war roadshow, appealing directly to active GIs.
Indeed, it was directed by the first woman in the Directors Guild, Francine Parker. More on that next time. But before we fully sign off, be sure to rate and review the show in whatever podcast app you are using. And if you enjoy the show, friend or two, let them know about it. Also, if you're gathering those friends to watch Milestones, let them know, hey, listen to this first. And if you love the show and feel so inclined and have the means, we do have a Patreon page set up. All the necessary things are in the links in the show notes. Until next time, I am Aaron.
And I'm Isaac. And, I'm still saying the same thing. Stay safe out there while you fight genocide in Gaza and in Palestine. And I say Palestine for a reason, because so much of the Israeli strategy has been around carving off Gaza into a separate issue than Palestine as a whole, right? The West Bank, East Jerusalem, if you're talking about past the Green Line, the occupied territories, quote unquote, but also all of the former Mandate, Palestine. Mandate being post-World War I carving up of the Ottoman Empire, the Palestine Mandate, which 78% of which is now the recognized borders of Israel. But of course, Israel controls all of the former Mandate. I mean, in many ways, including Gaza, right? Legally is still occupied if you control the airspace, land, and can enter whatever you want. Anyway, we're fighting a genocide. This is ongoing. Stay safe out there. Protect yourself, but we can't stop.